The night did not begin as a spectacle. It began the way many of Dean Martin's nights did in that era, wrapped in velvet expectation and cigarette haze, with the soft confidence of a man who had already proven everything he ever needed to prove. This was not his first time on a stage like this, and it would not be his last, but the room carried a different electricity than usual, the kind that hums before something unscripted happens. Those who had followed Dean closely since the events that unfolded earlier in the year, the whispers about his refusal to laugh along with cruelty, the quiet way he had stepped between humiliation and dignity without raising his voice, felt it immediately. Something was waiting in the air, unannounced and unplanned, and Dean, seated backstage with a glass untouched in his hand, sensed it too. The venue was packed beyond capacity, a cross-section of old Hollywood royalty, new money celebrities, athletes, journalists, and ordinary fans lucky enough to secure a seat. The crowd had come for charm and music, for the familiar ease of Dean Martin's presence, but they had also come because Muhammad Ali was in the building. Ali was already a storm wherever he went, not just a boxer but a symbol, a lightning rod for admiration and resentment, confidence and controversy. He was young, magnetic, unapologetically black in an America that still flinched at such things, and his presence alone unsettled rooms built on polite illusion. Some people cheered him loudly when he entered, others clapped politely, and a few stayed silent, their discomfort hidden behind glasses of whiskey and forced smiles. Dean watched all of it from a distance before stepping into the lights. He had seen crowds like this before, seen how admiration could turn sharp when someone refused to shrink, and he understood the danger of moments that looked like entertainment but carried something darker underneath. Earlier in his career, he might have leaned into humor to smooth it over, might have let a joke distract from an uglier truth, but the Dean Martin who walked onto that stage now had learned the cost of silence. He did not announce that lesson. He carried it quietly, like weight that strengthened the spine rather than bent it. The show began smoothly, almost deceptively so. Dean's voice settled the room the way it always did, steady and warm, a sound that suggested safety even when the world outside the walls felt unsteady. Laughter came easily, applause followed naturally, and for a while the tension seemed to dissolve into applause and shared pleasure. Muhammad Ali sat near the front, relaxed and smiling, his long limbs folded with casual confidence, enjoying the music and the moment. When Dean acknowledged him with a respectful nod, the room reacted instantly, applause swelling, cameras flashing, the meeting of two icons sending a visible thrill through the audience. It was meant to stay there, a moment of mutual respect, but injustice rarely announces itself politely. It slips in through laughter that cuts too close, through comments disguised as teasing, through the assumption that someone powerful can be turned into a novelty for the comfort of others. A promoter, emboldened by alcohol and the false courage of authority, leaned into a microphone off to the side and suggested, half joking, half daring, that Ali come up and show some of that famous footwork. The words were delivered with a smile, but the undertone was unmistakable. It was not an invitation, it was a test, a way to see whether Ali would perform on command, whether he could be turned into amusement rather than honored as a guest. The crowd laughed, unevenly. Some laughed because they thought it was harmless. Others laughed because they were relieved someone else had said what they were thinking. A few did not laugh at all. Ali's smile tightened, his eyes flickering for just a moment with something heavier than humor. He had faced worse than this, far worse, but humiliation has a way of exhausting even the strongest spirits when it comes disguised as entertainment. The promoter pressed again, louder this time, framing it as a challenge, his tone edging toward mockery, daring Ali to entertain the room. Dean Martin felt the shift immediately. The music behind him softened, the laughter lost its warmth, and the room leaned forward, hungry for reaction. This was the injustice, quiet but sharp, wrapped in applause and expectation. Dean did not move right away. He let the silence stretch just long enough for the discomfort to become undeniable. He understood timing the way a master understands breath, and he knew that rushing would dilute the moment. When he finally spoke, his voice did not rise. It did not scold. It simply carried. He smiled slightly, the familiar ease returning to his face, and turned toward Ali with genuine respect. He acknowledged him not as a novelty, not as a spectacle, but as a man who had earned his place in the room. Then Dean did something unexpected. He stepped back from the center of the stage and gestured, not commanding, not challenging, but inviting himself into vulnerability. With a gentle shrug and a calm tone, he said that if there was going to be any dancing, it would only be fair if he embarrassed himself first. The room froze. Laughter stalled mid-breath. No one had expected that. Dean Martin, the epitome of controlled cool, began to move, not in mockery, not exaggerated for laughs, but with playful sincerity. His steps were light, slightly offbeat, charming in their imperfection. It was not a performance meant to dominate. It was an offering meant to disarm. The crowd's laughter returned, but it was different now, warmer, relieved, directed at Dean himself rather than at someone else's expense. Only then did Dean look back at Ali, eyebrows raised in a silent question that asked permission rather than demanded compliance. Ali stood slowly, the hesitation in his movement noticeable, but easing as he took in the shift in energy. The humiliation had been diffused, replaced by something closer to equality. When Ali stepped onto the stage, it was not because he had been challenged into submission, but because the space had been made safe. What followed was not the spectacle the promoter had wanted. There was no contest, no winner or loser, no punchline at Ali's expense. Instead, there was joy. Ali's footwork was light and effortless, his movements full of rhythm and pride, and Dean followed with playful attempts to keep up, laughing at himself, inviting the audience to laugh with him rather than at anyone else. The music swelled, applause thundered, and for a brief, shining moment, the room forgot its divisions. But the true turning point came when the music stopped. The applause faded into a heavy, expectant silence. Dean placed a hand lightly on Ali's shoulder, not possessive, not performative, just human. He looked out at the crowd, his expression calm but firm, and said a few words that landed harder than any speech. He reminded them, gently, that talent was not a trick, dignity was not entertainment, and respect was not optional. He did not name racism, but he condemned it by refusing to participate in it. He did not shame the promoter publicly, but the message was clear enough that the man's face drained of color. The silence that followed was profound. It was the kind of silence that forces reflection, that leaves no room to hide behind laughter. Some in the crowd felt tears sting their eyes, surprised by the depth of their own reaction. Others shifted uncomfortably, confronted with the realization that they had been complicit, if only through silence. Ali nodded once, his expression unreadable but softened, and the two men shared a moment of mutual recognition that needed no words. When the applause returned, it was different from before. It was slower, deeper, layered with something like gratitude. People stood not because they were told to, but because they felt compelled. The promoter never touched the microphone again that night. The injustice had been addressed without violence, without spectacle, without cruelty, and the resolution felt earned rather than forced. Later, as Dean left the stage and the night wound down, there was no grand celebration of what had happened. Dean did not boast, did not frame the moment as heroism. He returned to his dressing room quietly, as he always did, pouring a drink he still barely touched. Mohammed Ali stopped by briefly, thanking him not with exaggerated praise, but with a simple, sincere nod. Dean returned it with the same quiet respect, understanding that some moments mattered precisely because they were not turned into legends by those who lived them. Years later, people would talk about that night in fragments, in recollections colored by time. Some would remember the dancing, others would remember the silence. But those who had been there, who had felt the room change, understood the deeper truth. They had witnessed a man with immense cultural power choose restraint over ego, dignity over applause, justice over convenience. And in doing so, Dean Martin had reminded everyone watching that sometimes the most powerful way to change a room is not with force, but with grace, timing, and the courage to stand still until others are ready to listen. That was the legacy of that night, and it carried forward into every story told afterward, not because it was loud, but because it was right. The applause from that night still lingered in the air weeks later, not as sound, but as memory, following Dean Martin, the way a shadow follows a man who has stood in the right place at the right time. What had happened on that stage with Muhammad Ali had already begun to slip into legend, retold in softened tones at dinner tables and dressing rooms, often stripped of its discomfort and polished into something easier to digest. But Dean knew better. He understood that moments like that did not end when the curtain fell. They unsettled people. They exposed things some preferred to keep hidden. And in an industry built on image and illusion, exposure always came with a cost. The invitations kept coming, grander than before, yet threaded with something cautious. Studio executives praised Dean's class. Journalists framed the incident as charming spontaneity, and promoters laughed a little too loudly when they mentioned it, as if volume could bury unease. Beneath the compliments was a quiet tension, the unspoken question of whether Dean Martin would continue to be safe, predictable, agreeable. Hollywood loved dignity, but only when it did not interfere with comfort. Dean sensed the shift immediately, not because anyone said it aloud, but because rooms grew quieter when he entered, because jokes stopped mid-sentence, because certain men measured their words more carefully around him. The next test came disguised as honor. Dean was asked to host a nationally broadcast charity gala, an event designed to celebrate unity, culture, and American excellence. The guest list was impressive, carefully curated, and unmistakably political in its balance. Muhammad Ali's name appeared again, this time as an honoree. Publicly, it was framed as progress, as generosity. Privately, the pressure was different. There were concerns, murmurs about Ali's tone, about whether he might say something uncomfortable, about how the audience might react if he did not soften himself for the room. Dean was encouraged, subtly but persistently, to keep things light, to steer conversations away from anything serious, to remember that the purpose of the evening was entertainment, not statements. Dean listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, his posture relaxed. When the suggestions ended, he nodded once and thanked them for their trust. He did not argue. He did not promise. Those who mistook his calm for compliance would soon learn otherwise. The night of the gala arrived polished and precise, the kind of evening designed to photograph well from every angle. The ballroom glowed with soft light, chandeliers reflecting off crystal glasses and immaculate suits. The audience applauded on cue, laughed when expected, and watched carefully when Ali entered, curiosity mixed with calculation. Dean took the stage with the same composed ease he always carried, his voice steady, his presence grounding. He opened with warmth and humor, easing the room into comfort before guiding them, almost imperceptibly, toward attention. As the program unfolded, it became clear that something was wrong. Ali's scheduled speaking time was quietly shortened. A segment meant to honor his humanitarian work was condensed into a brief mention, while others received extended tributes. The injustice was subtle but unmistakable, a deliberate shrinking of space, a way of reminding Ali that celebration came with conditions. Dean felt it immediately, the same tightening in the room he had felt before, the same uneasy laughter when the program moved on too quickly. This time the challenge was heavier. There was no heckler, no drunken voice to confront. The wrongdoing was institutional, sanitized, hidden behind polite smiles and schedules. Dean stood at the podium, aware that cameras were rolling, that millions were watching, that any deviation would be remembered. He could follow the script and preserve his standing, or he could do what he had done before, quietly, decisively, without spectacle. When Ali was finally invited to stand, Dean did not introduce him with the prepared lines. He paused, letting the silence stretch, the way he had learned to do when truth needed room. Then he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with clarity that cut through the ballroom's polish. He spoke of courage, not the kind that throws punches, but the kind that stands firm when the world asks you to bend. He spoke of dignity that does not ask permission. He named Ali's achievements without exaggeration, without fear, restoring the weight that had been stripped away moments earlier. The room changed. Some faces hardened, others softened. Ali listened, his posture straight, his eyes steady, the respect in Dean's words unmistakable. When Ali spoke afterward, he did so calmly, without provocation, his words thoughtful rather than fiery. The audience listened, truly listened, not because they were forced to, but because the space had been reclaimed. The applause that followed was restrained at first, then grew as people realized what they were responding to. It was not rebellion they were clapping for, but fairness. It was not defiance, but balance restored. Dean closed the evening without commentary on what had occurred, without congratulating himself, without inviting debate. He simply thanked the audience and stepped aside, allowing the moment to stand on its own. Backstage, the reactions were mixed. Some thanked him quietly, gratitude flickering in their eyes. Others avoided him altogether. Dean accepted both responses with the same calm indifference. He had not acted for approval. He had acted because silence would have been a lie. As he left the venue that night, the weight of consequence settled more firmly on his shoulders. He knew there would be conversations he would not be invited into anymore, doors that would open more slowly, if at all. But he also knew something else, something steadier. He had learned that justice, when delivered without anger, carried a force that lingered longer than outrage. And as the city lights passed outside his window, Dean Martin remained exactly what he had always been, a man who understood that real power did not demand attention. It commanded respect simply by refusing to look away. By the time the gala footage aired nationwide, the story had begun to move without Dean Martin's permission, reshaped by editors, softened by commentators, and debated by people who had not been in the room when the air itself had shifted. Some praised the elegance of the evening. Others spoke cautiously about unexpected moments. A few, louder than the rest, questioned whether Dean had overstepped, whether entertainers should involve themselves in matters better left unspoken. Dean heard none of it directly. He had learned long ago that the loudest opinions rarely mattered most. What concerned him were the silences that followed, the calls that did not come, the invitations that quietly disappeared. The studio, where Dean had a long-standing residency, began to hesitate about renewing certain appearances. Nothing was said outright. Schedules were blamed, budgets cited, demographics discussed. The injustice this time was not public humiliation, but quiet exclusion, the kind that erased people gently enough to claim innocence afterward. Dean recognized it immediately. He had seen it happen to others, especially to those who made powerful people uncomfortable without ever raising their voice. This was how the industry punished restraint, by pretending it was irrelevant. Then came the request that confirmed his suspicions. A network executive invited Dean to lunch, framing it as a friendly conversation, a chance to clear the air. The restaurant was discreet, the table secluded, the tone polite. The executive praised Dean's talent, his longevity, his brand, then carefully pivoted. He suggested that Dean's recent moments, while admirable, risked distracting from entertainment. Audiences, he said, wanted escape, not reminders of division. He implied, without saying it, that Dean's future on certain stages depended on his willingness to stay neutral. Dean listened the way he always did, eyes attentive, posture relaxed. He did not interrupt. When the executive finished, Dean took a sip of water and placed the glass down deliberately, as if marking time. He did not argue about morality. He did not lecture about history. He simply said that neutrality had never protected dignity, it had only protected comfort, and comfort was not what audiences truly remembered. He thanked the executive for the meal and stood, ending the conversation without hostility. The executive did not try to stop him. The consequences arrived faster than expected. A major televised special Dean had been scheduled to headline was abruptly postponed, then quietly cancelled. Officially, it was a programming decision. Unofficially, the message was clear. Dean was being reminded that even icons were replaceable when they refused to play their part. The industry assumed he would retreat, soften, or at least grow cautious. What it underestimated was Dean's understanding of timing and space. Instead of fighting publicly, Dean accepted an invitation from a smaller venue, one that lacked prestige but carried history. It was a theatre known for hosting artists who spoke when others would not, a place that valued presence over polish. The decision puzzled many. Why would Dean Martin step down from national broadcasts to a room that held a fraction of the audience? Dean did not explain himself. He understood that scale did not determine impact. The night of the performance, the audience was different from his usual crowd. There were fewer celebrities and more ordinary faces, people who had followed his career quietly, who sensed that something honest might happen. Mohammed Ali attended again, not announced, not spotlighted, simply present. The mood was expectant, intimate, almost reverent. Dean took the stage without fanfare. His performance unfolded slowly, deliberately, every pause intentional. He spoke between songs, not about controversy, not about himself, but about respect, about how entertainment had the power to either reinforce silence or break it gently. The injustice he addressed was broader now, unnamed but unmistakable, the erosion of voice through fear. He did not accuse, he invited reflection. Midway through the evening, a heckler attempted to disrupt the tone, shouting a comment that belittled Ali's presence, cloaked in the familiar language of just joking. The room tensed. Ali remained still. Dean did not look angry. He did not raise his voice. He simply stopped playing, let the sound fade, and looked directly at the man. The silence was absolute. Then Dean said calmly that jokes required consent and dignity did not belong to the loudest voice. He waited, unblinking, until the heckler shrank under the weight of the moment and sat down. No security was called. No scene followed. The injustice was neutralized by attention alone. The rest of the night unfolded in quiet triumph. Applause came not in bursts but in sustained waves, the kind that lingered because they were earned. When Dean finished, the audience stood, some with tears, others with hands pressed together as if holding something fragile. Ali embraced Dean briefly, a gesture heavy with mutual respect. News of the performance spread differently than before. There were no flashy headlines, no controversy to exploit, just word-of-mouth reverence. People spoke of how the room had felt, how something rare had occurred. Industry figures took notice, not because they agreed, but because they sensed a shift they could not control. Dean returned home that night aware that his choices were narrowing his path and widening something else entirely. He understood now that justice did not always roar. Sometimes it stood quietly in smaller rooms, refusing to be diminished. And as the city settled into sleep around him, Dean Martin knew that the next challenge would not be louder or easier, but deeper, asking not whether he would speak again, but how much he was willing to risk by continuing to listen to his own conscience. The shift became undeniable in the weeks that followed, not through confrontation, but through absence. Dean Martin noticed how his name was spoken more carefully in rooms he was no longer invited into, how producers referenced him in the past tense, even as his performances continued to sell out elsewhere. Hollywood had a way of rewriting relevance quietly, and Dean recognized the pattern. It was not anger that moved him now, but clarity. He understood that once you refused to be managed by fear, the cost was paid not all at once, but in small withdrawals of access and favor. Then came the invitation that felt different. It arrived handwritten, unexpected, from a civic organization planning a nationally televised cultural celebration tied to American heritage and music. The event promised visibility and reach on a scale Dean had not touched since the cancellations began. The letter praised his contributions, his influence, his ability to bring people together. But there was a condition, gently phrased yet unmistakable. The program would be tightly structured. Speeches would be reviewed. Improvisation would be discouraged. The goal, they said, was harmony, not disruption. Dean read the letter slowly, folding it with care when he finished. He did not respond immediately. He had learned that timing mattered as much as intent. When he finally agreed to participate, he did so without negotiation, without insisting on exceptions. Those organizing the event took his acceptance as a quiet concession, a sign that the industry's pressure had done its work. They mistook composure for surrender. The rehearsal revealed the deeper injustice. Dean noticed how certain performers were positioned at the margins, how introductions were calibrated to emphasize some legacies while reducing others to polite acknowledgments. Muhammad Ali was again present, invited as a symbolic figure, his name useful, his voice inconvenient. His speaking segment was removed entirely under the justification of time constraints. No announcement was made. It was simply erased. Dean felt the familiar tightening in the room, the same atmosphere that preceded every moment he would later remember clearly. He watched Ali accept the change with practiced restraint, his expression calm but distant, the cost of such acceptance written in the stillness of his posture. Dean understood that this was not about one man or one evening. It was about who was allowed to be fully present and who was asked to remain decorative. On the night of the broadcast, the audience was vast, the stakes higher than ever. Millions watched from their homes, unaware of the careful omissions that had shaped what they were about to see. Dean stepped onto the stage knowing that any deviation would be magnified, criticized, perhaps punished. He also knew that silence would complete the injustice already in motion. The turning point came without spectacle. When Dean reached the segment meant to transition between performances, he paused. Not long enough to alarm producers, just long enough to disrupt expectation. He spoke not about policy or protest, but about gratitude, about the people who shaped American culture, not only through talent, but through courage. He spoke of voices that had been celebrated when convenient and muted when uncomfortable. Then, without naming the omission directly, he invited Muhammad Ali to stand. The camera hesitated, unsure, then adjusted. The audience murmured. Ali rose slowly, surprised but composed. Dean did not hand him a microphone. He did not ask him to speak. He simply stood beside him, allowing presence to do what words could not. The silence stretched, heavy and unmistakable, until the crowd began to applaud. It was not loud at first. It grew as understanding spread, as viewers sensed that something unscripted and honest was unfolding. No rules were broken. No speech was given. Yet the injustice had been exposed and reversed in the only way that mattered. Ali was seen, fully and publicly, not as a symbol, but as a man worthy of standing where he stood. The producers could not cut the moment without cutting Dean himself. They let it live. Afterward, there were consequences. Calls were made. Explanations were demanded. Dean accepted them all with the same calm he brought to the stage. He did not defend himself. He did not apologize. He simply stated that dignity required space and that he would continue to make room where it was denied. Public response was overwhelming, not explosive but steady. Letters arrived by the thousands. Viewers spoke of how the moment had stayed with them, how the silence had said more than speeches ever could. Even those who disagreed struggled to dismiss it. Something irreversible had happened. Dean returned home that night exhausted but certain. He knew the path ahead would narrow further, that comfort and approval would continue to recede. But he also knew something else had solidified. His legacy was no longer defined solely by songs or charm, but by the quiet insistence that justice could be delivered without shouting. that power could be exercised without cruelty. And as dawn approached, Dean Martin understood that the final test was no longer about whether he would be allowed to stand on the stage, but whether the stage itself would ever be the same again after he had stood there. By the time the broadcast faded from public conversation, the effect of that single, silent moment continued to ripple beneath the surface, reshaping relationships in ways that no one could fully control. Dean Martin felt it most acutely in the quiet hours, when the phone did not ring and the city outside his window seemed to move on without him. Offers slowed to a trickle. Some disappeared entirely. Others arrived altered, smaller, cautious, stripped of the authority he once carried without question. This was the price of refusing to be predictable. Dean accepted it without complaint, but he did not mistake it for coincidence. What troubled him more was not the loss of stages, but the way some people began to speak to him as if he had changed, as if dignity were a phase rather than a principle. Friends advised him to rest, to step back, to let time soften the industry's memory. They framed it as concern, but Dean heard the fear underneath. Fear that standing too firmly would eventually leave a man standing alone. He thanked them, listened patiently, and continued as he always had. He understood that the deepest injustice was not punishment, but pressure to forget why you acted in the first place. The next confrontation did not come from executives or promoters, but from a public institution whose influence reached far beyond entertainment. Dean was invited to participate in a nationally significant commemorative event, one meant to celebrate American unity during a time of visible social strain. The symbolism was deliberate. His presence would signal continuity, reassurance, calm. Behind closed doors, however, the expectation was clear. He was to represent nostalgia, not conscience. His role was to remind audiences of a simpler time, not complicate the present. During preparation meetings, Dean noticed how certain names were invoked only when useful, how the contributions of black artists and athletes were spoken of in softened tones, their struggles reduced to background texture. Muhammad Ali's name surfaced again, this time as a risk, a figure whose presence might distract from the intended message of calm. Dean listened, absorbing the implications without reacting. He knew this pattern too well. Celebration without truth was simply erasure dressed in ceremony. The night of the event carried the weight of expectation. Flags, orchestras, solemn speeches, everything carefully designed to reassure. Dean waited backstage, listening as one speaker after another praised unity while avoiding the cost required to achieve it. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the awareness that silence would complete the illusion. When his moment came, he walked on stage with the same unhurried grace that had defined his career. The audience greeted him warmly, grateful for familiarity. Dean began as expected, speaking of music, of shared memory, of how art had the power to bring people together across differences. His tone was calm, almost gentle. Then he shifted, subtly, without announcement. He spoke of unity not as comfort, but as responsibility. He spoke of the courage required to stand beside someone when it is inconvenient, when it risks applause. He did not mention Ali by name at first. He described him instead, a man whose discipline, conviction, and humanity had expanded the idea of what American strength looked like. The room grew quiet. Cameras lingered. Dean then did something the organizers had not anticipated. He stepped away from the podium and invited Ali to join him, not as a surprise, but as a correction. There was hesitation from the crew, confusion at the edges, but the audience responded before anyone could intervene. Applause rose, steady and undeniable. Ali walked onto the stage with measured dignity, his expression composed, his presence grounding the moment rather than inflaming it. Dean did not frame it as protest. He framed it as completion. He said that unity was not achieved by smoothing edges, but by honoring those who had been asked to carry more than their share of history. He spoke briefly, then stopped. He did not need more words. The injustice had been named without accusation, addressed without aggression. The reaction was immediate and lasting. Some officials were furious. Others, privately, expressed relief. The audience felt something resolve inside them, a tension they had not realized they were holding. Letters poured in again, not only from admirers, but from people who admitted they had never considered how silence functioned as harm until that night. For Dean, the aftermath was quieter. The cost continued to accumulate, yet something else arrived with it, something steadier. Younger performers began to seek him out, not for career advice, but for reassurance that integrity could survive consequence. Dean did not offer speeches. He offered presence, the same gift he had learned to give publicly. As he sat alone later that evening, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond his window, Dean reflected on how power had shifted. It was no longer measured by applause or access, but by the ability to stand without bitterness. He knew the final chapter was approaching, not as an ending, but as a reckoning. The question was no longer whether he would be challenged again. It was whether the world watching would be ready to understand what he had been showing them all along. The final test did not arrive with warning or ceremony. It came quietly, almost respectfully, the way the most consequential moments often do. Dean Martin was asked to appear one last time on a national stage, framed as a tribute to a lifetime of achievement. The language was careful, the tone reverent. It was described as a closing chapter, a celebration of legacy. Those arranging it believed this would be a moment of reconciliation, a way to fold Dean neatly back into the story without reopening the discomfort he had created. They assumed age would soften resolve, that gratitude would replace insistence. They were wrong, though not maliciously so. They simply misunderstood the nature of the man they were honoring. Dean accepted the invitation without hesitation, not because he needed it, but because he understood what moments like this made possible. The venue was grand, the audience immense, the atmosphere weighted with nostalgia. Clips from his career played on massive screens, laughter and music reminding everyone why he had been loved for so long. Applause rose again and again, sincere and deserved. Dean watched from the wings, calm, reflective, not moved by pride, but by perspective. He saw not just what had been celebrated, but what had been omitted, the long arc of comfort and courage intersecting again in the same place. Muhammad Ali was there too, older now, quieter in body, but unchanged in presence. His inclusion this time was not an accident. It was a concession to reality, a recognition that history had already linked their names. Still, there were boundaries, expectations about what would and would not be said, how much space would be given. Dean knew them all without needing to be told. When his turn came, he walked onto the stage to a standing ovation that felt less like celebration and more like acknowledgement. He waited, allowing it to pass, his expression composed, almost solemn. When he spoke, his voice carried the same warmth it always had, but there was a depth to it now that quieted the room immediately. He thanked those who had shared his journey, not individually, not selectively, but broadly, including people the room had once been uncomfortable naming. He spoke of success not as popularity, but as alignment, the rare privilege of being able to recognize yourself in the mirror even after the lights went out. He spoke of the moments he was most proud of, and they were not framed as performances, but as choices. Choices to pause, choices to stand still, choices to refuse laughter when laughter demanded someone else's dignity as its price. Then he did something simple, almost unnoticeable unless you were paying close attention. He turned toward Ali and gestured for him to come closer. No speech accompanied the gesture. No justification followed. Ali stood beside him, and Dean placed a hand lightly on his arm, not to claim the moment, but to share it. The cameras lingered. The audience was silent, completely, reverently silent. Dean looked out over the crowd and said the fewest words he had spoken all night. He said that history did not need more voices raised in anger. It needed more people willing to make room. He said dignity survived not because it was protected by power, but because it was defended by restraint. He said that if anything he had done was worth remembering, it was not the songs or the smiles, but the moments when he chose not to look away. There was no applause at first, just breath. Then someone stood, then another. The sound that followed was not thunderous, not explosive, but sustained, the kind of applause that carries weight because it arrives slowly and stays. Some in the audience wiped their eyes. Others simply watched, understanding they were witnessing closure, not triumph. After the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, there were no arguments, no demands for explanation. The industry had learned what it needed to learn. Dean Martin had not fought it. He had outlasted its resistance by refusing to become what it expected. He left the venue quietly, as he always did, without escort or ceremony, stepping into the night with the same measured pace he carried everywhere. In the years that followed, that final image endured. Not the headlines, not the speculation, but the sight of two men standing side by side in silence, one offering space, the other receiving it without spectacle. Younger artists spoke of it as a lesson. Audiences remembered it as a feeling. Historians would later struggle to categorize it, unsure whether to call it entertainment, protest, or something else entirely. Dean Martin never tried to define it. He understood that the most powerful stories were not the ones you explained, but the ones you allowed others to carry forward. And so his legacy settled not as a myth, but as a standard. A reminder that dignity could be defended without fists, that justice could be delivered without cruelty, and that sometimes the most unforgettable act on a stage full of noise was the courage to stand quietly, making room for someone else to be seen.